Good afternoon. My name is Dustin Siggins with Proven Media Solutions. I have Drew and Aaron with me, and today we're going to talk about crises in 2025. What's out there between AI, politics, DEI, ESG, and everyday business decisions like, I don't know, Southwest alienating half of its fan base, and companies like Meta just making huge moves that draw headlines, but are they really bad for the company? So we're going to tackle all of that and more with Drew and Aaron, who are the crisis experts, and me, the journalist who's going to do the interviews. So this should be a good time. Drew and Aaron, do you want to introduce yourself?
Drew, go first.
Okay. My name is Drew Kerr. I run the Four Corners Group. I'm an executive communications coach, but I also have a practice as well of crisis prevention, working with companies and executives in preventing them from getting into trouble in the first place.
Hey, everybody. My name is Aaron Walker. I've been doing public relations now for almost 25 years, about the last 15 really specializing in crisis communications. I'm the managing director of public relations and crisis communications at a Washington, D.C.-based firm called Think Big. And we really operate in that area, that intersection of public affairs and crisis communications, public relations. As Drew and Dustin know, it's very uncommon to not have one problem without the other, right? So if you have a reputational or operational crisis, it oftentimes morphs into public affairs issue. And if you have a public affairs issue, oftentimes it directly impacts your reputation or your ability to operate.
You know, one of the things we were talking about yesterday in our prep call was how to talk about some of the biggest crises, maybe that tie into politics, because there's an us versus them political culture in this country, without being political. And Drew, you first raised that concern in our emails a few weeks ago. And can you dive a little bit into the difference between crises that have a political flair or a political flavor versus talking about politics? Because as I think you said it first yesterday, Aaron, is we have to be objective, but we also have to be aware of what's happening in the world.
I think the right way to look at this is that companies, brands, people have become more scrutinized than ever before as the political climate over the years has become more polarizing. Everything has kind of, I think we could all agree on that, has become almost synchronized in that regard. There's, every little thing has become far more scrutinized as far as special interest groups and political parties, and sometimes, brands' own customers, to a degree, the nth degree. But the fact is that whether it be outside groups or, getting into the middle of certain issues that in the past would not be considered political, now, become a reflection of this, high-powered polarization. And, it probably, transcends, normal, reaction to, heightened things. So it's you can't really talk. There are certain plenty of crises that have nothing to do with politics, but these days it's very easy to walk on a landmine, a political landmine, even when you don't think you are, because of the high scrutiny and polarization factor.
And Aaron, you mentioned objectivity yesterday, and both of you did, but I think Aaron, you had brought it up first, was that we all have our political opinions and viewpoints and everything else, but we have to be objective if we're going to be the crisis consultant or crisis leader within a company. How do you stay objective? I don't know your politics actually, so how do you stay objective?
I think it's really hard. There's a couple things you have to do when you are really in the firefight. Number one, you have to check your ego at the door, and you also have to, again, then check your politics at the door. And sometimes those things are really, really difficult because you might have a personal aversion or a personal preference to the client or the issue. But I think for us, we're paid for our professionalism. We're paid for our ability to bifurcate emotion and data. And so oftentimes when I am dealing with a crisis, one of my first calls or my first actions is to talk with our data and insights people to help us see the true data behind an issue. Is it really spreading? Is it really volatile? Is it, what's the tone of the conversation? And those little bits enable us to make better decisions that are based on actual information rather than emotion, rather than our gut, or our political preference. And, it might be a little trite, but the fact of the matter is these are the reasons that corporations hire folks like Drew and myself, is because we
Right.
understand that need to be able to separate.
Yeah, there's definitely a sensitivity factor, and I think that if, in order to do our job, we have to be as well versed as possible as to the hot buttons, as to, what might set people off. And having data absolutely is critical, and having research, but understanding that, yes, you have to check your politics at the door, but everybody knows what sets generally everybody's buttons off. And if you're not
Right.
sure, you still want to check on your data, because the fact is, if the overall object is keeping the peace, right, and not creating a firestorm, then it's understanding what those hot buttons are, and using research, as Aaron mentioned, to make sure and to understand that we don't want to step in those areas, or those things might set people off.
I think that's an interesting point, though, Drew. Is our job is I'm gonna pose the question. I don't know if our job is just to keep the peace, though, right? Is our job to keep the peace or navigate the crisis?
Well, it depends on what point in time. I think the timeline, I think we're really talking about a timeline thing here, because in the end, we certainly we could want to navigate crisis, but in the end, we certainly want the crisis to either peter out or absolve itself, or come to some kind of understanding. I mean, there's multiple solutions to a crisis, but there's also early in the timeline where we don't want to get, where we're looking for a way to not even get into the mess in the first place. And so we need to understand, what does the audience look like? Who are our users? Who are our customers? If we use certain images or say certain words, is this faction going to be upset? And how big is that faction? And what can that faction do? So we have to, in a sense, almost prognosticate, before we even get into the crisis phase.
Yeah, I
And when
think.
you
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Dustin. No, go ahead.
No, you're good. You're good. This is going to be a free-flowing conversation, so I'm going to interrupt you guys more than you'll interrupt me, just personality trait. So when you talk about peace, do you mean helping the company keep peace with its key stakeholders? Is that the operational definition here, Drew?
Yes, it means, right. What I mean is that there's different constituencies. Obviously, when a crisis takes place, you're talking about different constituents that, could be getting very angry or upset, or, fed up, or whatever the emotion is that you're triggering, or it could be a political thing too. Or it could even not even be necessarily a direct constituency. It could be one that you didn't even anticipate that is rocking the boat. So, but in the end, the goal is to not only to navigate it, but to uh, figure out a way in the long term, and when I say keep the peace, that it's, a situation that doesn't, damage the brand. You may want to minimize the brand damage, so that, there's a future ahead, and you can communicate a positive future.
Aaron, does that match your definition of peace, or do you think that peace is maybe too much like compromise, where Chris Voss talked about compromise with a husband and wife might be the black shoe, and the brown shoe being worn to an event as the worst of all worlds?
Yeah, I think that Drew has a fair point. I think what we're talking about is that I don't know if peace is how I look at it in terms of make sure that everybody's happy. But to Drew's point about having an environment wherein we can move forward, recognize the mistakes of the past, solve either the reputational or the operational issues that caused the problem in the first place, and then
Yep.
move forward. I absolutely agree with that. I think Drew also said something important, which I don't think companies pay nearly enough attention to, and that is the idea of risk and mitigation. The preparedness efforts, the preparedness activities that should be happening on an annual basis to help you plan, to look, to Drew's point, identify new and upcoming potential stakeholder groups so that you are able to be more nimble and agile when these issues do occur.
Now, when it comes to planning, right, sometimes these injuries are self-inflicted, and sometimes culture changes. And we talked yesterday about, look at my notes here, Five Guys, receipts go online, customers complain, and nobody seems to care, even if it gets headlines. Brian Nickel came in as Starbucks CEO, and there were headlines every 4 days about was he violating the company's RTO policy.
Right.
But outside of those headlines, from what I could tell, and I'm not a crisis expert, it didn't really seem to impact key stakeholders all that much. But contrast that with cereal for dinner, Kellogg's CEO, or what's happened with Tesla, what happened with Target 9 years ago with conservatives, and now today with liberals. Go ahead.
Let me tell you that I spent 10 years working with the research firm YouGov Brand Index, which tracks
Oh, wow.
the public perception of about 1,000 major consumer brands in the US.
Mhm.
And after you work long enough there, you see how these things many crises are short term.
Right.
When some controversial ad or whatever it is, it could last from 3 to 5 days. There's
Mhm.
apologies and I mean it causes a firestorm, but the fact is that the public generally has a fairly short attention span, and they're
Yep.
already moving on to the next crisis. It's like a dog and a squirrel. Whoop, 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 but it is
Yep.
like that. It's very
Yep.
much like that. So you have to be sort of a case that really hits home in a certain way, sort of a confluence of circumstances that it lasts longer, that a crisis, has legs. So, for example, you mentioned the Kellogg's thing, when the Kellogg's CEO went on to CNBC and was there, would double down, triple down that people should eat cereal for breakfast. That even the
Mhm.
CNBC host was a little surprised at that, but he was sticking clearly to the message that he, discussed with his,
Tom's team.
his team, right? And there's something that crossed over widely out of CNBC,
Right.
which is
Right.
strictly, the world of finance, to the mainstream in a huge way because it struck a nerve with inflation at a time where inflation was just like
Exactly.
hitting really hard. But people are
Mhm.
also health conscious, and then you've got the whole mother contingency. Okay, which is
Right.
completely apolitical. You're a mother, and you're being told, wait a second, I've got to feed my family. I should be feeding my family cereal for dinner, and that it's good for you. You know that. That had legs for a while.
Yeah, see, Drew, I think you hit on an important point there, which is some crises occur simply because somebody doesn't like the way something sounds or feels or looks,
Mhm.
right? But then there are instances where something happens where it's personally offensive to a
Yep.
very broad audience, right? And that's where we see issues get serious legs, right? And those, to our conversation yesterday, those are the ones that are founded in, like very personal issues, DEI, family, the things that we hold dear to ourselves that, by the way, can cross across a ton of different target audiences. That's where we see crises that have legs. And I'm going to double down on this. That's why when you're doing your crisis planning and your mitigation work, you have to be creative in how you think. I think, Drew, you mentioned the idea of prognostication, like your, the great and powerful Oz, but you have to be looking at all of these potential target groups, how they might react. I had a client once, super interesting, fast food chain, one of my absolute favorite fast food chains. And they would occasionally ask us to just review upcoming ad campaigns to see if they might have an edgy ad campaign. And the crisis team would look at it to see if it could just raise enough trouble to cause an issue. And that's the kind of stuff we're talking about, right?
But not many companies do that. I mean, that's more of the exception than the rule.
I agree with that.
Because the fact is that being edgy, which is, with a number of companies and brands who think that's a cool thing to do, is a very, very difficult line to walk, because, you're basically walking a very thin line with, between sort of satirical and funny and deeply offensive. And it's a very hard line to navigate.
And Burger King ran across this a few years ago. Their UK branch or whatever, they decided to put out a tweet that said, I got to think of the exact phrase. It's time for women to be in the kitchen. Their goal was to promote a scholarship program for women to be chefs, because they're paying their
I remember chefs. Remember that.
And at the time, I thought, oh, that's a fairly clever turn on an old, sexist, misogynist idea. The rest of the digital world disagreed, and Burger King retracted that and issued an apology a day later. But at the same time, some things get huge news. Meta, right? Meta was accused of a whole lot of things a few months ago, betraying their values, sucking up to Trump, and a lot of other things. And at the time, one of my colleagues said, there's a lot of bad headlines right now, and X and other platforms are going crazy, but I'll bet the investors are going to be really happy. And we found out from the earnings report that actually investors were quite happy with Meta's strategic decisions over the last 6 months. So let's dive a little bit into that. One of the things we talked about yesterday was determining the scale of the crisis versus the scale of the opportunity. You guys have both talked a bit about planning. So let's dive into some of the sort of nuts and bolts here. Let's, if there's a major decision that has to happen, we're looking 6 months out. Let's say there's an election, you don't know who's going to go, where the election's going to go. How do you begin to take the temperature? How do you begin to plan? What data, Jeremy Tunis and Alex Dudley on my post yesterday talked about using technological tools, digital tools to take that temperature. How do you start that process?
Well, there's research, obviously, as Aaron knows. YouGov Brand Index, as I mentioned, has extensive research by political party and all those brands, and they do that. There's a great organization, there's a great research company that's based in England that does a lot of work here called Sigwatch. I don't know if either of you have heard of them, and they track activist investors for companies, mostly public companies, but not all of them. But they are able to track activist behavior like way ahead of time, so that companies can get a good smoke signal. And really, that's what it is. You're kind of reading smoke signals about what could happen. So there's definitely on the ground research. Aaron, you probably have your own data that you could kind of figure that stuff out and divine the data with.
Yeah, I mean, look, for every person that might view this, there are countless ways that you can go about finding this type of information and getting the groundswell, right? It can be as easy as following social media and having a social media monitoring platform that can give you sentiment, right? And an idea of brand loyalty. You can also use options like Consult, who has some incredible capabilities. But I think that folks who are looking for these types of bits of data should be applauded, because the fact of the matter is regardless of where you find it, it's what you do with it. It's this idea of here's my baseline. And then you can understand if you find yourself in a trust deficit or a reputational deficit when it comes to your trust, or whether or not you have a little bit of leeway. And so what we see are, so there are a number of companies that have an incredible amount of brand affinity. And so to Drew's point, they're more willing to be out there and be edgy because they have that capability. But companies who might find themselves in a deficit when it comes to favorability, popularity, depending on how you look at the crosstab of what you're looking at, they have to be far more conservative and controlled in how they respond to things. And so that ability to to lean in on your brand, that's you with that data that tells you where you can start from.
And you don't mean conservative and political, you just mean restrained and careful.
That's right.
Okay.
Right. I think that's a wise move because you don't have to be political. You could just also
Right.
stay the course and stay, to avoid and make sure, and we talked about this yesterday, that there should be a checks and balances system. You want to make sure that that internally, in some way there's an objectivity so that you're not going to accidentally steer the wrong way in your marketing, your branding, your comments,
Right.
or anything like that. Some campaign that's going to offend some group. You
Yep.
need, a lot of the smartest work and the best work is done in advance, right? I mean, we talked about it's it's cheaper to prevent a war than fighting one, right? As we
I
talked
took
about.
that from our conversation yesterday. I wrote
Right,
that down.
right. It's cheaper to prevent a war than fighting one. So, enough companies need to understand that, and because there's a very common mentality that I'll worry about a crisis when it happens, which is probably the biggest problem with many companies is I'll worry about it when it happens, and
Right.
and which is a huge mistake, especially now, because of the sensitivities.
Yeah, you're able to reduce that tail. If we look at the crisis cycle, right? The event hits, you begin to mitigate, you begin to change your operations, fix it, you go back and monitor it, see how it's coming. And eventually there's a tail, right? There's this tail end, and that tail end it's demonstrably shorter, and you're able to recover much quicker if you have the planning in place on the front end. That's
Well,
exactly right.
And one of the so I was a political journalist, so I used to pay a lot of attention to protests, activists, boycotts, and most of them, and Drew, you said this yesterday, most of them don't work. They might be loud, but they don't actually have an impact, especially if you don't let them. If you just don't respond, maybe, and you let it fizzle out because it's loud, but just because they're loud, it's a participation bias.
It's hard to do a boycott. It's hard to keep. I mean, just the stamina required for a large group of people to keep a boycott going is an incredible effort. I mean, it's just hard, and that's why most of them fizzle out. Most of them.
Well,
Right, but Drew, wouldn't you argue? I would also argue that for most of the protests and boycotts that fizzle out, it's because, again, what you have is a smallish concerted group of people that are talking to each other.
that's right. It's
It's like
exactly
this,
right.
it's this incredible echo chamber. And so it's like, yeah, he's right, he's right, he's right. It's almost like this call that we're currently on. We all agree with each other. But the
Well, let's
point,
really talk about politics and find out where we don't.
right. But as soon as a boycott is able to break out the other direction and stop talking to each other and engaging outside groups or unusual partners, that's where a boycott really gets legs and is able to find significant impact.
Well, looking at that, is that feedback from you guys? I
I can
apologize.
definitely hear feedback.
I'm good.
Aaron, do you want to throw yourself on mute for a second? Let's do a test and see if it's you on your end. Okay. Looks like it might be on your end, Aaron. I think. So maybe it's me. Anyway, I'll keep my statements short and see if it's me. Because then now I'm hearing myself, which no one wants to do that 3 times. In 2021, Delta entered that controversy with the voting rights issue in Georgia. They only came out in favor of it, then they went against it, and they ticked up everybody. Bud Light did something similar with their ad campaign, and then their statement they released afterwards was just blah, and it ticked off everyone else on the other side. If they had just taken the temperature, both of those companies could have avoided the political brouhaha that they created.
Well, there's a lot there are certainly seems to be a few times during the year where a company completely misreads their audience, which is surprising in this day and age, but it still happens. So Bud Light, 1000% misreading of audience. Not all of these are political. I mean, I think about, last year, the Apple advertisement, that Crush advertisement, for the new iPad, which was pulled within 48 hours because so many creative people who make up the lifeblood of Apple was so deeply offended that they pulled that ad. So, and even Bumble was the other one that completely misread its audience last year with its outdoor billboards. That women became so incredibly offensive about being celibate as a solution, and they had to take down those billboards also. So there has to be a self-awareness, but awareness of your audience to misread who your constituents are. Bud Light for sure. I mean, the most political and obvious biggest one that's going on now is Target. Because in 2020, when all the protests were going on and Black Lives Matter was going, Target went 5,000% into DEI and all these programs. And then, and now since they pulled DEI, all their users who they've built very close relationships with feel that they had the rug pulled out from under them. And that's a very tough decision. Now, and their earnings are dropping. So I think it's a tough thing that companies have to figure out what to do, to navigate that fine line with their diehards, their followers, their audience, and reading the political winds and what they should do.
I also think it has to do with a company forgetting its own mission and values in a trade-off for a quick and easy, perhaps pop culture type win. I think that Target's a fantastic example of that, where to Drew, you're right. They leaned in so far on their DEI initiatives. And then with the change of these political winds, they've gone 180 degrees the other way, which leave the politics out of it. A company that goes back and forth on its operations and things like that, you are going to absolutely offend one entire segment. So the question is why not stick with the ones who have been with you from the beginning and who hold your missions, your values is the same.
When Chick-fil-A almost had that problem a few years ago, I mean, you want to talk about major protests. The mayor of Boston tried to legally block them. Airports around the country, mayors are trying to block them opening up at airports. They won all those cases. And the company has now, I looked it up a few years ago, they're the most liked, they're the most respected, the most polite. They also make more money per location than any other fast food restaurant. The last number I checked was a couple of years ago, but something like 700,000 more per location than McDonald's, and they're only open 6 days a week. But when they stopped funding the Salvation Army, that was a big hit to their conservative base. But I think they've done actually an admirable job of rising past that, because I don't think anyone really thinks of Chick-fil-A as conservative anymore, even though they're still closed on Sundays. They're more viewed as just this mainstream, everyday fast food chain.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that the majority of Americans definitely, if you look at the founding family who runs Chick-fil-A, I think the majority of Americans would absolutely. I'll go out on a limb on this one and say I absolutely believe that the majority of Americans believe that Chick-fil-A is still a highly.
Let me put a little narrower blade on that. What I mean is, Starbucks has liberal cultural values, but it's a coffee shop. Oh, and by the way, they're more liberal. Versus a Ben and Jerry's, for example, where their politics are like front and center of everything. And I think that's, Starbucks and Chick-fil-A, I think, be more akin to each other, where Chick-fil-A's politics aren't at the front and center of their brand anymore. I think it's more secondary than it was 10 years ago, at least comparatively.
That's fair. That's fair. We also see. Oh, go ahead, Drew.
No, but what Aaron said was 100% correct. Is you don't turn down the people who brought you to the dance, and when you have I mean, it's every marketing professor would tell you that when you have this, and that's how you grow your audience, when you have an audience that is following you because of your values and what you stand for. I mean, every little basic building block of brand building, and you've got this huge audience, and then all of a sudden the political winds change and you switch, that is, you can't, how do you trust them in the future? That's the other thing, is the damage is long lasting, because how do I know what's going to happen? What if the presidency changes in another 3.5 years? You're going to go back to where you were
Well,
4 years ago.
that's right.
It's a very, it's not a race, it's a marathon. And people remember these things. Just like they've stuck with you all along, they don't trust you because you pull the rug out from under them.
Right.
So, you know, the interesting thing about Target is that they completely ignored the whole, they rolled back the DEI thing, and there were all these boycotts and protests, and they said nothing during it. They just basically didn't even acknowledge them, like nothing. And it wasn't until the earnings from just like a week or so ago, where the reports were down and they said they lowered their financial expectations for the year. It's the first time that they publicly acknowledged the boycott and actually publicly acknowledged that it had an effect, although they didn't know to what degree. So it's, they kind of painted themselves into a corner, a very weird corner that I'm not quite sure how they're going to get themselves out. And I'm curious, and this might be an interesting exercise as to, well, what would we do? How is it possible now that they've painted themselves into a corner from a communications perspective? What do we do?
Oof. I mean, at this point, they kind of have to ride it out. I mean, I think they probably thought, a lot of people say that, the DEI drawbacks, if you will, the backing off on it from the corporate side happened upon the election. But even as early as mid-2023, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink was saying he's not going to use ESG anymore, that term, because it was already toxic. And a ton of corporations early last year, the first half of last year, long before Trump was leading in the polls, were pulling back from this anyway. I wonder if Target thought, well, we can just kind of sneak in behind the other 15 or 20 major corporations that have already done this. And I wonder if that was their thinking.
If we look at Target and we compare it to other corporations that have really strong brand affinity and user loyalty, I'm thinking of two in particular, which would be Cliff Bar, which full disclosure, ages ago I worked for them and all through college, and then Patagonia, right? Two really great companies. Both are viewed as liberal/progressive organizations. Cliff Bar, of course, headquartered in Berkeley, California. These companies are more than willing to double down, including being involved in lawsuits against, Trump administration. Again, I'm not saying right or wrong in terms of the politics. I'm saying these guys have done a phenomenal job of remembering who they are and what they stand for, and their customers are loyal because of it. And it's a perfect snapshot of a company that is not getting blown in the winds.
Well, and let's pivot off of politics a bit here, because I realize we've kind of done that for a while. And there's more crises out there than just those that are caused by, if you have an R or a D.
Of course.
Southwest, for example, their seating decision, their bagging decision. We brought that up yesterday, Drew. And I can't tell which way it's going to go, because you have to have cash in the bank and be able to financially run your organization at the same time.
I think we have to look at it industry by industry. I mean, the thing is, Southwest does have that thing in common with Target, is that they took the thing that made them stand out, part of their brand DNA, and literally surgically removed it, from all the people who swear and follow South by Southwest. The difference is with Target, there are many other retailers. It's very easy for people to drive 3 more minutes to the next Walmart or to Marshall's or other places. Airlines, different story, because it's consolidated to such a degree. Now, the thing about Southwest is the main instigator of what got this whole thing started was because they have a whole bunch of new investors, who want to make them profitable. And so they basically said, you know what, you're going to have to be like every other airline. You're going to have to charge for bags. You're going to have to do this, and if you saw the social media reaction from I mean, people love South by
Oh, yeah.
Southwest. And this was an incredible rebellion that I saw online. Now, yesterday I think it was yesterday or today, they started $35 a bag unless you're and seating also has changed unless you have a Southwest credit card. And now they're basically like every other airline. I see them doing now some promotions to try to ease people's anger, like other sort of promotions, at the same time to sort of divert from people who are going to be having to pay now $35. I don't know if Southwest is going to have the problems that Target's going to have because the airline industry has consolidated to such a huge degree. They still may not have a choice.
Well, I think it's interesting to have a look at that because in my opinion, and I'm sure the communication team Texas at Southwest will be irritated if they ever watch this, but I think it's a communication problem that they have first and foremost. They didn't properly communicate this and introduce this policy. They didn't properly help people understand the why, right? And there's an incredibly famous book, right? Start with the why. So the whole idea of why they needed to do it. And I think if Southwest would have done a better job from the beginning of bringing people along in their thought process, people would have understood it a lot more. And I think that they would have been still very irritated, right? But they would have at least had the understanding of why things were changing. And, we talked a little bit about share price earlier, but Southwest shares are rising with this announcement. So if their target audience is their board and investors, then they're doing great.
They probably nailed it.
Yeah.
And one piece I wrote for PR Daily a few months back, I forget exactly when, was how do you get out of a crisis that you've created? Like if you're Boeing, which has spent, according to some people I've read and spoken to, has spent since the late 90s when it was bought out. I forget the company that bought it out, but it changed from quality of manufacturing to trying to grow and be more profitable. Could that have changed the company's trajectory because of the accidents they've had, the door, the bolt? I mean, Boeing's potentially in a lot of trouble. It may, yes, it has 80 years of history and government contracts and other things, but the MAX crashes, hundreds of people dead, the stuff that happened, the several incidents that happened last year. Likewise, Starbucks kind of seemed to have given up part of its culture, not the political part, but the smiles on the cups and other things that made it not just another, coffee experience, but a different kind of one. How, when you're in the middle of a crisis, let's say you're past, you didn't plan ahead, right? You didn't, Aaron, prepare everybody for what's going to happen. Now you're in the middle of it. Target, Starbucks, whatever, like depending on the issue set. At what point do you just write it out? Again, I'm not a crisis expert. At some point, I think you might just have to shut your mouth and just try to put out drumbeat positive news because you've already dug that hole.
I don't know if I would never say write it. That's like saying hope is a strategy, which it's not, right? And so I think what you want to do is when you are in these really difficult things, for what I counsel our clients when we are looking at truly difficult front page story reputational issues, right? Oftentimes those are driven by an operational decision or vice versa, right? And so I think what you have to do is you have to take a moment, take a step back, and go back to the baseline and say, all right, what did we do that caused this issue? Or if we didn't cause it, what was the instance wherein we found this crisis starting point? Go back there, examine what the facts are, what the data is, and then slowly begin to fix it. Now, to be clear, you cannot communicate yourself out of a crisis. You just can't. But what you can do is have a solid communications plan. You can talk to the right target audiences at the right time, and you can be open and transparent. And those things will put you on a path. And then you just keep trudging along, which I think is your write it out. But then what you must do after that is throughout, you have to stop and you have to evaluate and you have to look what's working.
Yep.
And if things are not working, if you're not seeing that improvement, then you need to go back and re-examine. But if things are working, then you keep on that path. It's a circle.
People do admire CEOs and executives who are transparent and can do the mea culpa and communicate, but at the same time, I would say, even Aaron, is to make sure that all that communication contains the values of the company, that this is important to you. You know, you still have to drumbeat those values into all the messaging, that you're there to fix the solution, to fix the problem and to find the solution. And then make sure that you don't forget them, and make sure that you report into your constituents. Here's what's going on. Here's the progress we made. We do consider this very important, because I think that there is a sympathy factor, there is a human factor. Everybody, they've broken something in their lives. They dropped their iPhone in the toilet. Everybody's done something. So I think that transparency and sticking to message of values and importance, and of course, the future, the positive future, will help lead everybody out of it.
Well, that's a really good point, Drew. And speaking, I'm a practicing Catholic. The worst thing the church did was cover up, in some cases cover up, other times just simply make mistakes, but there was a lot of cover up. The New York Times had I hate to say this, wonderful article in 2010 detailing how concerns were brought by bishops from around the world to the Vatican in the late 80s. And then later Pope Benedict, but Cardinal Ratzinger admitted, like, we kind of blew it off. We didn't realize the scope of what was going on or the level of the cover up to some degree. And he later took ownership of that as Pope, but like, people make mistakes. It's like police departments when they try to cover up their buddy killing somebody or making an unfair arrest. It's the cover up that makes it worse. You come out and say, we're human, we're an institution, we made a mistake, and here's how we're going to correct it. As you said, Aaron, very transparently, very concretely. And then you show through your communication that you're doing that. A lot of times those crises, you can get out of that hole, which I think is kind of what you're both saying. Aaron, you're
Things
on.
always, things always look worse on the cover up. There's no question. I mean, that should just be, a motto that every CEO should understand, and every communications officer should swear by, and know that the cover up always will make things worse. And then when it's uncovered, it says everything about the personalities of everybody and the morals and the ethics of everybody involved, versus just being transparent and walking through the crisis with transparency to solve it and bring it to a better future. Is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, I think pivoting on that a little bit, and I do think there's one point that's being being made, which communications people would probably all agree with. If we all put them in a room, 10 out of 10 would say yes, which is communications people need to have a seat at the table. I'm an ardent believer that a chief communications officer should not ever report to a chief marketing officer.
Oh,
And
you're a Perry Hedrick.
Yeah, when there's an old, for people who have an advanced degree, master's degree in PR, that you study the excellence theory by Grunig, who wrote it in the 80s. But the idea that true communications find success when communicators have a seat at the table, at the big boy table, right? And you're able, at the big kids table, and you're able to truly talk to the leadership and be a part of that leadership. And that's when crises, by the way, I firmly believe that if your council has a middleman to the CEO, it's going to be not intentionally, but it can be misconstrued. It can be misinterpreted. And so when we're getting through these definite crises, one of the things that is critical for organizations is for the comms people to report directly to the CEO and not through a marketing function.
So this is a huge issue, and LinkedIn communicators talk about this a lot.
Yeah.
And often they blame the CEO. And I've written a little bit about this. I call it speaking C-suite,
Sure.
where instead of saying, again, from the PR side, we got more media coverage, or we got the big piece of media coverage. It might be Sarah Evans and her team at Zen Media do a wonderful job of breaking this down into not just how it's going to impact the bottom line or reach key stakeholders and decision makers better, but also how does this impact, say, their POC at the clients and put it in their bottom line terms as well. So how can the crisis, communicators make sure we have that seat, not we, you have the seat at the table? Because again, it seems like PR is a nice to have, comms is a, yeah, we've got to have it, but we're going to give you a smaller budget and less decision-making authority than you deserve. But how much of that falls on the communications team for not proving value in the way the C-suite can understand, especially in crisis?
Drew, I've been talking a bunch. You want to answer that?
No, it's, I mean, it's an incredibly valid point and very important. I mean, I kind of insist upon it. And frankly, some of the best relationships, and Aaron, you might have had this too, and Dustin as well. I mean, some of the best relationships, professional and constructive relationships I've had is when the president or CEO, I'm working with them and we're working in synchronicity. Whether they decide on, oh, we're going to launch this, we're thinking about doing this. And you make sure that you're attending the meetings also. That it's not secondhand, that you are actually invited there to the meetings where things are discussed so that you have a voice along with everybody else. It's an equal playing field with the top executives. The other thing is you have to make sure that you're working with a CEO or president who listens. That's a very critical point, is you want to work with people who listen, who value what you have to say.
Yeah.
That there's reason why you're saying these things, and you want them to think about these things because they're not professional communicators and they need to understand, these other factors that might, come into an announcement or a piece of news or somebody being fired or hired or a new division or anything. It has to start at the origin point. Very important.
Yeah, I used to have a boss, a CEO boss of mine, and I would always tell him, you don't pay me to tell you yes, you pay me to tell you the truth. And I think that's a very important, we call it building relationships of trust, or BRT, building a relationship of trust. And if a CEO knows that you're going to give them the unvarnished truth, no matter how difficult the conversation is, then they can trust the counsel that you're giving them. And the more you're able to do that, the more that your counsel is received, the more you're able to ensure that you have that seat at the table.
Well, Stephanie Roberts calls it the yes and approach,
Sure.
or the no and approach. And I'm actually writing a piece next week. I'll probably reach out to both of you guys for interviews on it. It's a piece on turning crisis preparation into bottom line conversation. And it's an idea given to me by Dave Trosnak, where we are the comms counsel in the crisis. You would never go to court without your attorney.
Sure.
Why would you enter a crisis without your comms counsel? And I think that's a really good analogy that the lead management can understand.
I mean, I would say that's an okay analogy. I think it's basically, I think what's more appropriate is to show that you are part of the team, that it's not just when you show up at court, but it's where you are on equal footing with the head of marketing, the head of personnel, everybody who has that title. You are on the same, they have, you have their ears, you listen to them, you're sitting at the same meeting, and you could speak as equally as they can. So it's really all coming to the dance at the same time.
I agree with that. And you better figure out a way to have a great relationship with your general counsel in times of crisis, because
Yes.
you're going to become best buddies. And
yes.
and, traditionally comms and legal, sometimes they butt heads, right?
Butt heads, absolutely.
Very competing interests, like completely competing interests. And so I have found that when I'm working through crises, it really helps to have that ability to build a relationship with the counsel and the legal team so they understand where you're coming from and you understand where they're coming from, and you find that middle ground to be able to operate efficiently in times of crisis.
Again, my ignorance is going to show here. I'm surprised that legal and comms, like legal wouldn't give comms the advice of this is what we can legally say. And comms says, great, let's drive down that lane. Where does the conflict come in?
Well, I think that there's just, I mean, comms people, we want to talk, right? That's inherent. It's what we want to do. And legal folks want to constrict all of the great things we have to say. And so what we're trying to do is find this push and pull with counsel. Well, maybe we can tone down and we'll calm down here, but surely we can say this, this, and this.
Right. It's a lot of it has to do with how to communicate when it comes to attorneys, because they're great as far as, if they're a trial lawyer presenting a case like that,
Sure.
but they're not communicators to the public and to,
Right.
investors. They are attorneys. And so
Yes.
they use a very specific legal language that people could spot very easily that doesn't sound
True.
like the way normal people speak. And if
True.
it doesn't sound like the way normal people speak, sounds like a lawyer, it sounds like, a team of lawyers wrote it.
That makes sense.
A perfect example is after the United Healthcare president, was it the president or the CEO, the one who was shot?
CEO.
It was the CEO who was shot, and then, but the I think it was the president or whoever it was, he, like 3 days later, made a private recording to the top staff, basically saying, we know what we're doing. I mean, already caused this huge backlash against how people and patients were treated. And I mean, it just brought up the ugliest backlash against United Healthcare. So he kind of dissed the public, said people don't know what they're talking about, and recorded this video. Needless to say, in 2 seconds, that video leaked. Okay? People have this illusion that videos don't leak. And once that leaked, he issued an apology, but you can tell that this apology was written by lawyers because of all the language. Like everybody said, written by lawyers, like not from the heart, written by lawyers.
Yep.
And that's a whole different, if it's not from the heart, if it sounds like it's written by lawyers, it has a lot less credibility. And it doesn't go over it. So that's part of also that tug of war.
Another great example of that is a handful of years ago when United had their issue, and United Airlines, not healthcare, with Dr. Dow being dragged off. Remember the first statement the CEO Oscar Munoz put out talked about reaccommodating the passenger. And reaccommodating is not bouncing someone's face off an armrest, right?
Well, or blaming the customer 7 times before you admit it was your company's fault.
And all that to say, you can tell when a lawyer is communicating. And Drew hit the nail on the head. So that's where that push and pull comes from.
That makes sense. So guys, let's wrap up on this. Aaron, you sent over 7. What'd you call it? 7.
Oh, the drivers of severity of a crisis. Yes.
The drivers of severity of crisis. And Drew, you pointed out that there may be something missing in it. So I'd love for you guys to kind of hash this out in the 5.
Well, I think I think Aaron should just go through the 7 quickly so I could.
Come on, I wanted to tease it. I wanted to get people thinking you guys are gonna have a fist fight here on Zoom.
Oh, I don't think we're not. There's no fist fighting. Come on. Listen, I think that I'm just pulling it up on my screen. So there's 7. What we talk about are these 7 points. So number 1 is, and we're not talking about. I guess you'll see what we're saying, but we're not saying these cause it, but these can contribute to how severe your crisis would get. Number 1, your organization. Right? Are you adhering? And we've talked about this already. Are we adhering to the mission, the values, and the transparency of the organization? Number 2, the speed of engagement, meaning does your organization have a bias for action, or were you slow to respond? Number 3, momentum, right? Are there people on the ground in the area that are active, and the minute something happens, they're on it? And so you get yourself caught unaware. Number 4 is terrain. And what another word would be, I would argue, environment. Meaning, is there something bubbling under the surface? Is there something bubbling under the surface that just makes this perfect for a crisis. And if you haven't done your proper, crisis planning and preparedness exercises, you might not have that idea. Number 5, the potential for advocacy. Is this an issue where people can contact their congressman? We used to call it flooding the switchboard, right? Back when we talked about Congress, back when that was a thing, right?
Sure.
I'm aging myself there, but is this an opportunity to flood the switchboard and, call up problems on the Hill and whatnot? Number 6, have we violated trust at its base form? Have we violated the consumer, our customers, our clients' trust? And the last one is competency. Right? Is this just an issue where you just might have done something really dumb and it looks as though the leadership is incompetent? So those are the 7 that we use to kind of look at how a crisis is formulated and where it's headed. Drew, what were you thinking is missing?
Well, I don't know when those 7 were created at Edelman. But the thing that crossed my mind was the credibility of the media that's actually stirring up this potential crisis. Because these days, there's so much sort of what I call bottom feeder websites that specifically create sensationalistic stories. So and so is angry. They're reading about it. Users hate this. They kind of stir the pot. Of course, you don't know where this is coming from, but I always like to say consider the source, because sometimes is there really fire behind that smoke, or is it just a lot of little BS, this bottom feeder media or media that's just trying to stir something for the sake of stirring it, and nobody else is biting.
I think that's a great point, and something that public relations firms around the globe, not just the big guys, the little guys, and everybody in between, are trying to figure out this notion of, Edelman has kind of coined the trust barometer, but everybody is looking at this ability of how to determine, and for Americans to be able to better understand what is real and mis and disinformation. And I'll put a plug in for companies like Alethea and Blackbird AI and the companies that are doing real Strider Technologies that are doing really important work in identifying websites, bots, and state actors who are trying to color a conversation on American social media, which is where, as you guys know, the majority of Americans consume their news now.
Exactly. I was going to say that a lot of these stories originate on Reddit. Sometimes, they're the section that's known as ranting. They kind of originate there, and we don't know what the validity of these people, and do they represent any kind of substantial amount of people that really feel that way. But you're right. All those things come under that heading of the validity of the source of where it's all coming from.
Well, and the last thing I want to point out, we haven't said it yet, I think, too, is part of our political culture, or part of our culture in America, certainly is the political stuff we addressed earlier, but also with the speed of the internet and the low barriers to access to anything digital, someone can say something that is completely untrue. I mentioned yesterday, we were talking about Trader Joe's in 2020 was pressured to get rid of their ethnic food names. It made national news. I think Yahoo News hit it up. It was getting out there, but it was all because one college student got 120 signatures shortly after George Floyd was killed. And that was 120 signatures from some no-name college student, but at the right time it splashed, and Trader Joe's, made sure that they took the temperature, they made their choices. But how much, does the internet play a role in this, where again, anyone can get out there and yell, and it may or may not have validity, but people react to it?
Well, I think that I think you need to take a step back. If you think about the fact that, if you recall, 10 years ago or so, CNN started its ploy for citizen journalism. If you remember, right, that's when everybody started carrying iPhones and everybody had cameras. And so CNN made this, at the time, was a brilliant call amongst viewers to start sending in footage. And
Yep.
that's what started this whole new idea of shareable user content and driving. It was I would argue that that is a defining moment in news gathering globally, not just in the United States. And so now, to Drew's point, it is, yes, anybody can have a megaphone in this day and age. And so going back and kind of landing the plane on our original conversation about crises, which is true great crisis communicators are the ones that are going to be able to look at you squarely in the eye and say, you got to trust me on this one. This is not a big deal. And then the next day, look at the same CEO and say, all right, now we need to pay attention. And that's what great crisis communicators can do, is help our CEOs differentiate between the two.
I got nothing to add, Drew.
No, I mean, it's perfect. You know, when we deal with crisis prevention, we rank things from 0 to 10 when it comes to our clients, where where 10 is a nuclear bomb and 0 is, you can sleep at night. But what happens when things are in the middle area of a 4 or 5, and like that's, but clients need to understand that there's a risk to everything. And it's our job to help them determine how to handle that risk and, how valid that risk is. And things do move quickly day to day, as Aaron said.
And that's why it's important, to your point earlier, Aaron, that communicators have the ear of management, of the decision makers, because sometimes you can't wait when a crisis hits. You can't just, you have to gather that information and get it down up the ladder very quickly to make a decision. So guys, just think we should wrap up here, but this has been a lot of fun. As always, I like to bring people smarter than me and talk to them. So thanks guys for your time. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks, Dustin. Appreciate the time.
Yeah.
Take care.
Absolutely, guys. Take care.